"You're not my mother. You're nobody. You should have left me at the door where you found me." That's what my adoptive son said before looking me in the eyes and walking out the door. I didn't run after him, because as he was leaving, I already knew what he was going to find. My name is Lucia. I'm 58 years old, and it was in that moment, with the door closed and the weight of those words still suspended in the air of the living room, that I understood my son was carrying a pain far greater than the words he had chosen to hurt me with. A pain that had an origin, one I knew better than he imagined, but that had transformed into a knife pointed in the wrong direction. But to understand why I didn't go after him that day, why I sat there surrounded by that silence, you need to understand where this story begins. And it begins long before the fight, long before the trip, long before anything that happened in the last few months. It begins in a journalism school in the early 90s, when I was too young to know what life was going to place on my doorstep. Literally on my doorstep. But that comes later. Because to tell the fight, I first need to tell the build-up. And to tell the build-up, I need to start at the beginning. At the phone call that rang on a Tuesday afternoon and changed the size of everything I understood about my own life. I met Luciano in the first week of journalism school. He sat 2 chairs to my left and spent the entire class arguing with the professor about the role of the press in a democracy that was still learning what it was. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction, and I had known the difference since I was a child. In the months that followed, we kept running into each other on projects, at lunch in the cafeteria, in discussions that started about assignments and ended about life, about Brazil, about everything 2 young people excited about their own future can discuss when they have time and energy to spare. When we graduated, we worked at different outlets for a while, but different never lasted long between us. Luciano had a way of looking at the world that completed me in a way I hadn't expected was possible between 2 people. He saw the human side of any story before he saw the facts. He used to say the real story was never in what happened. It was in who was affected by it. And I learned at his side to use both eyes at once without sacrificing one for the other. We traveled a great deal over the years. We covered stories in places most people only know from maps, countries that were changing shape, cities that held stories the world needed to hear, people in situations we couldn't fully describe even to each other after we returned. We slept in hotels that appeared on no list, ate things we didn't know the names of, came back from some assignments with something inside us that had shifted without asking permission. And in that rhythm of life we had built, the idea of having a child never appeared in any serious way. Life felt complete as it was. It didn't seem to need anything more to be what it was. I looked to the future and saw the continuation of what already existed. More assignments, more cities, more stories. I was content. I was whole. Until the phone rang. It was a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary as any other Tuesday I would have had no reason to remember. I was in the living room with papers from a story spread across the coffee table when the phone rang. I picked it up without looking at the number, an old journalist habit, never knowing what's coming before you answer. The voice on the other end took a moment for me to recognize. And when I did, something in my body adjusted before any conscious thought arrived. It was Simone. Simone and I had known each other since kindergarten. We grew up on the same street, in the same neighborhood, went to the same school before each of us went our separate ways. It was one of those friendships with roots deep enough to withstand distance. You can go months, sometimes years, without speaking, and when you reconnect, it picks up from the exact point where it left off. No need to explain the silence in between. The silence is part of it, not a contradiction of it. Simone had a presence that didn't depend on volume. She walked into any room and the space around her quietly reorganized itself, as if people and objects adjusted for her without anyone having made that decision consciously. As a child, she was the one who invented the games everyone else followed. As a teenager, she was the one who convinced the group to do what they shouldn't, and everyone did it anyway, without being able to explain quite why. She had that quality that's impossible to describe to anyone who hasn't seen it up close. But Simone also had a specific difficulty with situations that grew too large. When something truly frightened her, she moved, not out of weakness, but because she never learned to stand still in the face of what scared her. She stayed in motion as a form of survival. And that's what happened with Jose Rodolfo, the boyfriend her parents didn't accept. They thought he was an impulsive young man with no direction who would hurt her in the long run. Simone thought her parents simply didn't understand what was between them. It's possible both sides had a part of the truth, as tends to happen in those family situations where love and worry sit on the same side but end up opposing each other. But at the time, she couldn't hear both sides at once. She only heard hers. They ran away together. They cut contact with her family, disappeared to a city her parents didn't know, and for months there was no news. I had lost track of Simone even before the disappearance. Each of our lives had gone in the direction it went, and the distance grew gradually, the way it does when no one decides. So her voice on the phone that Tuesday afternoon reached me in a way I hadn't expected. And the voice was different, not the tone. I recognized that immediately. It was the quality inside the voice that was different. Tense, low, like someone speaking from a place where they don't want to be heard by anyone except the person on the other end of the line. She said she was 3 months pregnant, that Jose Rodolfo had denied the child, called her unfaithful, and disappeared. That she was alone, without money, without anyone nearby. That going back to her parents was a wound she didn't yet know how to cross, because they had warned her, and no one knows quite how to ask for help from someone who told you you were going to get hurt and was ignored. And that she was thinking of resolving things in a way that frightened me. She didn't use direct words, but I understood. And what I felt in that moment was a pressure behind my chest that didn't ease with deep breathing. It wasn't anger, it wasn't judgment. It was fear of the kind that goes to your hands before it reaches your thoughts. Hands that gripped the phone with a force I hadn't planned. I begged her not to do it. I talked without stopping, without knowing exactly what I was saying, only knowing that I needed to keep her on the other end of the line long enough. I said there was another way, that the life growing inside her was not guilty of anything that had happened, that it shouldn't have to pay for it. That if she couldn't keep the baby, to give it up. That there were people who loved without needing to have created, that loving didn't depend on biology, that this child could have a good life if she let that path exist. She listened in silence for a time that seemed too long, and then she hung up, without making any promises. In the months that followed, Simone's silence was the heavy kind. I tried calling a few times. The number wouldn't connect. I sent messages, no reply. I was left with a weight I had no way to resolve, because there was nothing concrete I could do but wait, without knowing what for, without knowing if there was anything to wait for. Luciano would watch me when I came back to the subject after dinner, and after a while stopped asking about it. He just stayed close, which was always enough with him. And then, on a common Tuesday morning, he opened the front door and stood still. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I noticed Luciano's silence. That specific silence of when he encountered something he hadn't expected. Different from the silence of when he was thinking. Different from the silence of when he was reading. I had learned over the years to distinguish his silences as if they were different languages. This was the one for genuine surprise. I went to the door. A wicker basket. A pale blue blanket, faded at the edges as if it had been washed many times before arriving there. And inside the basket, a baby sleeping with that specific calm of a newborn that seems separated from the world by a pane of glass, completely inside its own sleep, unaware that it was on an unfamiliar doorstep on top of a welcome mat. Beside the basket was a piece of paper folded in 4, in small, slightly slanted handwriting that I recognized before I touched it. I unfolded the paper slowly, as if urgency might damage something that was already fragile. Simone's handwriting said, "My dear friend, please take care of him. The fruit of my mistake deserves more than I can give." Nothing more, no number, no address, no date, No signature. Just that sentence, in that handwriting, on that paper that I folded back exactly as she had left it. I kept it inside the document folder where I stored things I didn't know how to categorize but knew were important. And it stayed there. For 22 years, it stayed there. I lifted the baby from the basket. He had the specific weight of a newborn, dense in a way that doesn't match the size, as if there's more inside than the outside suggests. The smell was the kind that compares to nothing I knew. Dense, warm, with a specificity I still haven't understood how to describe, but that was imprinted with a clarity that time hasn't erased. I held him, and my body knew what to do before any conscious thought arrived. The arm curved in the right place, the hand went to the right place, the weight distributed itself in a way that felt as if there were muscle memory for it, even though I had never done it before. Luciano was still standing at the door, his hand on the handle, watching me. I looked at him, and neither of us said anything for a time I can't measure, because some decisions have already happened before your voice arrives. You only realize that when you're already on the other side of them. In the weeks that followed, we began the formal adoption process. It was long. There was a lawyer with thick folders full of forms, a notary's office smelling of old paper and stamp ink, a government office with a clerk who looked over her glasses as if she expected us to be making something up. There were days I left one place exhausted and still had another waiting. There were nights I sat with paperwork spread across the living room table while the baby slept in the bedroom, and Luciano brought me coffee that I drank cold because I couldn't stop. But at no moment, neither I nor Luciano hesitated. There was not a single second when either of us asked out loud whether it was the right thing to do, because it already was. It already had been. The question had been answered before it was asked, there at the door, with the baby in my arms and the folded note in my hand. Mateus. The name we chose. Luciano had done the research. It meant gift of God, and thought there was no more honest name for a child who had arrived that way, without warning, without preparation, like an answer to a question we hadn't even formed yet. The name felt exact, and when you find something exact, you don't need further argument. You only need the courage to keep it, and that was how I began to be a mother, without the 9 months everyone says exist for you to prepare yourself, without the pregnancy, without the hospital, without the physical memory of carrying from within. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday, I was already a different person. Not different from who I was before. The same, exactly the same, but with a new weight inside that was, strangely, the kind of weight that relieves. The kind that fills instead of pulls you down. In the early years, we learned what this was. Me, Luciano, and Mateus. There was no manual for that specific way of being a family we had become. A baby who became a boy, who became a child growing at a pace that seemed too fast to absorb completely. But we went along, 1 week at a time, getting things wrong and right in the same proportion that any family gets things wrong and right when they're truly trying. Mateus spent a good part of his childhood inside newspaper newsrooms. It's not a figure of speech. When he was little, he sat in actual newsrooms, in chairs too large for him, feet dangling, watching adults argue about the world out loud and with urgency. He learned to read before the expected age because he was surrounded by text, by headlines, by people who loved words in an almost inconvenient way. And that formed something in him that only became completely visible later. When he was around 7, we talked about the adoption. Luciano and I had spent weeks not rehearsing the words, but calibrating the tone. How to tell something that was good, that was ours, without making it seem like there was anything heavy or hidden inside it. We sat together one Sunday afternoon after lunch, with the table still set with the last dishes and the smell of food still alive in the air of the room. Luciano started. He had this way of talking to children that was neither condescending nor artificially gentle. It was honest, with appropriately sized words, without treating the boy as if he were made of paper. He said that Mateus had been born from a different womb, that there was a woman who loved him in one way and who then gave him up so that others could love him in another way. And that this was not abandonment. It was a choice made with a love she was capable of in the way she could have it, at that moment in her life that was very difficult. Matthias listened with that grave attention he always had. Since he was small, he was the boy who processed before reacting. He would go quiet, eyes fixed on a point slightly beyond whoever was speaking, as if he were reading something that wasn't being said out loud. After Luciano finished, there was a silence of a few seconds. And then he asked only one question. He asked if his name had come with him or if we had chosen it. Luciano explained the meaning, said we had chosen it because it seemed exact, gift of God, because that's what he had been to us. Matthias went quiet again, processing, and then said he liked it. Just that he liked the name. He didn't ask about his biological mother again in the years that followed, not directly. There were lateral questions from time to time, why the shape of his nose was different, why his hair had that texture, where the habit of tilting his head to the side when thinking came from. But they were questions of discovery, not of lack. At least, that's what I saw, or what I preferred to see. And today, looking back with more distance, I can't fully separate the two. What I saw with perfect clarity, throughout all those years, was the relationship Matthias had with Luciano. They were alike in a way that genetics can't explain, and that fascinated me every time I observed it up close. Both listened before reacting. Both had a patience with the world that seemed almost strange in people with so much fire inside them. Both believed every story had two sides, and that the side you hadn't heard was always the most important. Luciano nurtured this in Matthias with care and without rushing, like someone who recognizes a rare plant and knows they can't hurry its growth without ruining its shape. He would take the boy to cover stories when he could, when the situation allowed. Not as formal instruction with a prepared lesson, as shared experience. Matthias would sit in the back seat of the car while we discussed the day's story, and sometimes he'd ask something that revealed he had been listening the whole time, just inwardly in his own way. Luciano loved this. He said once that Matthias was going to be a better journalist than the two of us combined, because he knew how to listen without needing to be right all the time. There's a memory that hasn't left me for years. Matthias at 8 or 9, I don't remember the exact age, but it was around then. Asleep in Luciano's lap inside the car on the way back from a story we had covered in the countryside. It was the middle of the night. We had left late because the interview ran longer than expected, and Matthias had spent the afternoon in a small-town cafe where the young waiter kept appearing with something we hadn't ordered, a juice, a donut, a slice of cake on a small plate. Because it was the kind of place where people still did that. In the car, the boy stayed awake for about 20 minutes, talking with that specific energy of a child who spent the day suppressing enthusiasm and can finally let it out. He talked about the woman Luciano had interviewed, a detail in her voice that had caught Matthias's attention, a photo on the wall behind her that no one had commented on during the recording, the way she moved her hands when she reached the harder parts of her own story. His eyes were shining with the look of someone who saw something and still can't stop returning to what they saw. And then, mid-sentence, he simply fell asleep. From one second to the next, the way children sleep, without announcing it or saying goodbye. Luciano slowly adjusted his arm to hold the boy's shoulder without waking him. Matthias's hand rested open in his lap, fingers relaxed. The radio was at minimum volume, a song I didn't recognize, slow, with little urgency. And I, in the passenger seat, watched the two of them through the reflection in the dark glass of the midnight window, with the countryside passing outside and the roadside posts appearing and disappearing at a slow pace. There was something about that which I knew I would want to remember. I can't explain precisely how you know, but sometimes you're inside a moment, and something inside you quietly signals that this one will last longer than the others. I stayed awake the whole way just to hold on to that image a little longer. With the yellow light of gas stations passing from time to time through the dark window, with the radio low, with the boy's open hand sleeping on his father's arm. It stayed. It stayed with a clarity that other memories don't have. It stayed because it was one of the last times we were exactly like that. The three of us, complete, with nothing missing, nothing weighing on us. Luciano passed away 3 years ago. I don't need to go into the details of how. That's not what matters for this story. What matters is what remained. The cup he'd leave in the sink unwashed, saying he was going to use it again later, that I spent weeks still seeing there in the morning, expecting him to come collect it. The living room chair that was left with a shape that no one else will fill in quite the same way. The way the house became too large overnight, not in physical size, but in the silence. The size of the silence that remained where he used to be. I spent days reaching for my phone to tell him something and remembering mid-gesture that there was no longer anyone to tell it to in that specific way. That way of only one person understanding without needing context. That's the kind of absence that has no direct name and is therefore harder to carry, because you can't even name exactly what you're missing. Mateus was 19 when he lost his father. I watched the boy change in temperature, slowly, the way the air cools over the course of an afternoon, and you only realize you're cold when you already are, when the moment to get a jacket has already passed. He became quieter, more closed off in a way that I first understood as normal grief, then as part of becoming an adult, then as a way of being that was forming itself. It took me time to realize that silence was different from all the silences he'd had before, that this one had a hole in the middle that the others didn't. He went to study at a university 2 hours away. Communications, like his parents, as if it were inevitable, as if the journalism that had grown around him throughout his entire childhood had planted a seed he didn't know was there. He came home on weekends sometimes, called when he remembered. I let the space exist because I knew certain kinds of pain need distance to be carried. Forcing closeness on someone who needs distance is a form of love that hinders more than it helps. I had known this before I needed to apply it with him, but I watched. I always watched. On a Saturday afternoon, with Mateus home for the weekend, he was 22 in his second year of university, had just finished a project that had left him drained for weeks. I passed through the kitchen to get some water and found him sitting at the table. His coffee was in front of him. Full, untouched. He was staring at the surface of the table, not at his phone, not through the kitchen window, not at anything that was there. He was staring at the wood of the table as if trying to read something that wasn't written there. I got the water, filled the glass slowly, stood still for a moment with the cold glass in my hand, feeling the weight of it, listening to my son's silence 2 meters away from me. And then I turned and went to sit on the opposite side of the table, without asking anything. I placed my glass in front of me, looked at his cold coffee, and stayed quiet. There's an art to not asking at the wrong time. I learned over the years that certain conversations need silence to begin, that the right question at the wrong moment closes more than it opens. So I waited. I heard the sound of the refrigerator. I heard a car passing outside. I heard the kitchen clock marking time in a way I don't normally notice. And I heard Mateus's silence, which was full of something that needed space to emerge. When he lifted his eyes to me, I saw it. It was an expression that only appears on the face of someone who is about to say something they've carried for too long. An expression of exhaustion from keeping it. Of when the weight becomes too heavy to continue carrying alone without spilling somewhere. He said that since Luciano had passed, he had felt a hole he couldn't name. That he'd thought at first it was grief, that time would take care of it. But that time had passed, and the hole hadn't closed. It had changed shape, become more specific, more directed. That when he tried to understand exactly what it was, he always arrived at the same place. The beginning, the origin, the question he had never faced directly. He wanted to know where he came from. He wanted to meet his biological parents. He was careful as he said this. He looked at me directly while speaking, as if he needed me to understand this wasn't dissatisfaction with what we had. It wasn't a lack of love for what existed here. It was a part of himself that existed before me, before Luciano, before everything we had built together, and that he had never been able to find. A part that had always carried a question mark. I looked at my hands around the glass of water. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window in that slightly yellowish way it has when the day is fading. The sound of a car passing outside. Everything quiet beyond that. And I felt in that moment something that took me a second to identify. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't hurt. It was more like recognition, like when you see something coming from a distance and realize you've been waiting for it without ever having named the wait. I said I understood. And then I said something he clearly wasn't expecting. I said I knew where Simone lived. He watched me without speaking for a time that wasn't long, but had the quality of a deliberate pause. His expression changed, not exactly shock, but a careful astonishment. That astonishment of someone who receives large information and goes still for a moment so as not to damage anything before understanding what to do with it. I explained that years before, when he was still a teenager, and I already sensed that this search would come someday, because it always comes, because it's human to want to know where you come from. I had looked for Simone on social media. She wasn't hard to find. I reached out, we talked once, briefly. She asked about everything, about me, about Luciano, about work, about our travels, about everything except Mateus. And that specific silence around his name told me more than any words could have. But I had kept the number, the general address of the city where she lived. Mateus was quiet. Then he asked why I hadn't told him before. I said I had been waiting for the moment when he asked, not for me to push, that there's a very big difference between opening a path for someone and putting them on it without them having asked to go. He sat with that for a moment, that silent processing I've known since he was a boy. And then he asked if I was going to give him the contact information. I asked only one thing, that he let me reach out first, that he give me a few days before going, that I needed to prepare the ground before he appeared in Simone's life as an unannounced surprise, because appearing that way could close more than it opened. He nodded. I breathed deeply without letting it show. I thought the hardest part had passed. That we had reached an agreement that made sense, that everything was going to work out with care and calm, the way I had abstractly imagined for all those years. The conversation had gone well. Mateus was lighter when he got up from the table. The coffee that had gone cold there was the only sign that the conversation had lasted longer than it seemed. And I went to my room that night with the feeling that the right thing had been said at the right time. That the next step was mine, and that I knew how to take it. I was wrong about how easy what came next would be, but I would only discover that later. In those days between the conversation with Mateus and the call to Simone, I kept reviewing what I had stored about her. Not the childhood memories, but the person I had deduced over the years from fragments. The brief conversation on social media years before, the note I had read more times than I can count, the intuition that accumulates when you once knew someone deeply and spend decades observing from a distance. Simone had that quality of being unable to stay still when a situation grew too large. I knew that. And I knew that Mateus was exactly that for her. The material proof of a time she would prefer had existed differently, or that she would simply rather not open, not out of malice, out of self-preservation, that human instinct of not disturbing what was put away with such difficulty. But Simone was also my friend, had been, and some part of that friendship continued to exist, even crossed by decades, and by a note, and by a baby in a basket, and by everything that came after. Old roots have a permanence that time doesn't completely erase. I called on a Wednesday afternoon. I had spent the preceding hours trying not to rehearse too much, because when I rehearse a difficult conversation, I lose the thread of the true voice and end up with the prepared version, which sounds exactly like what it is. I sat at the living room table. The phone was in front of me. The note was there too. I had taken it from the folder without planning to, as if I needed it nearby at that specific moment. The paper was yellowed at the edges, slightly fragile at the creases of the folds where it had been folded and unfolded a number of times I hadn't counted. Simone's handwriting was still there, slightly faded but completely legible. 22 years that paper had been kept. 22 years I had preserved that piece of paper as if I knew that one day it would have a function beyond existing. I dialed. The call rang 4 times before she answered. When Simone's voice came from the other end, it was lower than I remembered from our only social media conversation. More measured, more contained, like someone who has learned from life not to react quickly before understanding what's coming. She recognized me before I finished introducing myself. She said my name as a question, Lucia, with a tone that could be surprise or apprehension, probably both at the same time, mixed in a way that even she might not be able to separate. I was direct but careful. I said that Mateus wanted to meet her, that he was well, that he was a young man of 22 with a well-formed head, but that there was a search in him that only she could help complete, not with a new relationship, not with an ongoing story, but with the truth of what had happened, with what was happening in her life when he was born, with the reasons that led her to make that decision, stated honestly, without a polished version to protect anyone. She was silent for a moment. I heard her breathe on the other end. Then she said she was married, that she had 2 young children. Her voice changed quality when she said that. There was something she wasn't naming. Not declared guilt, not calculated coldness to protect herself. It was more like someone speaking of a new life, while the other one still exists somewhere, stored in a place she prefers not to have to open. I said I understood, that I wasn't asking for anything beyond one thing, that if she received Mateus, to be honest, not to try to protect herself at his expense, to tell the truth about what had happened, even if it was hard to say, even if it was hard to hear from the other side of the conversation. Another silence. And then she said yes, with a voice that had the weight of someone agreeing to something larger than the conversation happening in that moment. A weight of someone who knows they're agreeing not just to the meeting, but to an account that has existed for 22 years and whose time to face has come. We arranged to meet at a park in a small town in the interior of São Paulo state on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks away. She didn't want José Rodolfo present. She said this briefly and firmly, without explanation. I understood and didn't ask for one. There were certain things she needed to carry alone in that meeting, and that was her way of doing it with as little external weight as she could manage. When I hung up, I looked at the note on the table for a moment. I placed my hand over the folded paper, the paper she had left with a baby she couldn't keep, and stayed quiet for a time, thinking about everything that small piece of paper had crossed to arrive there. 22 years. And now it was about to be completed in a way I couldn't control, only prepare for. I could only trust that preparing was enough. I found myself asking the question that had no answer. Would she honor the request when Mateus was standing in front of her? Would she have the courage to tell the truth when she was looking at the son she had left in a basket 2 decades later, after having built an entirely other life? There was no way to know that before it happened. There was only trust, in the Simone I had known, in the pain I had heard in her voice, and in the path I had opened so that everything might have some possibility of going to the right place. In the weeks that followed, Mateus organized himself for the trip. There was a different lightness in him, not exactly joy, but less closure. A quality of anticipation that I recognized as hope, even though he didn't use that word. We talked about other things most of the time, about university, about a project he was finishing, about films he had seen, about ordinary everyday things. The trip appeared at the margins of conversation from time to time, briefly, as if talking too much about it might damage something that was still fragile and needed to arrive whole at its destination. As all of this was happening, I wondered how many people go through this in silence. How many mothers are sitting at the table with their coffee cooling, holding on to information for years, waiting for the right moment that has no guarantee of ever coming? How many stories remain frozen because no one knows how to take the first step without certainty that the ground will be there on the other side. The week before the trip had a different quality in the air of the house. It wasn't exactly tension. It was an awareness. A knowing that something was about to change without knowing exactly in which direction. We functioned normally on the outside. He studied in his room, I read in the living room, we met for dinner and talked about ordinary things. But there was something underneath it all that neither of us named. An underground layer of expectation that stayed present without needing a voice. The evening before his departure, I was in the living room sorting old documents, the kind of task that appears in moments when you need to keep your hands busy without thinking too much, when Mateus came and sat on the sofa. I made coffee without deciding to, as a reflex, and placed the 2 cups on the coffee table. He picked his up, took a sip, looked at the window for a moment. He was about to leave. The large backpack was in his room, already closed. The trip was real. Tomorrow it would truly begin. I said carefully that I hoped he would be emotionally prepared for what he might find. That Simone had a structured life, a family with young children, a routine that didn't naturally include this meeting. That the truth he was going to hear might not be simple to carry at first. That I wasn't trying to discourage him. I wanted him to arrive with more balance than expectation, with his feet on the ground, as well as the dreams he had built over 22 years. He set the cup down. Slowly, more slowly than the gesture required. And he stared at it for a second that seemed to carry more weight than it should. He said I didn't need to keep interfering, that it was his life, that he knew what he was doing, that he didn't need me managing his expectations as if he were still a child who couldn't take care of himself. I answered calmly that it wasn't interference, it was care, and that they were very different things. But he didn't hear the difference. Or he heard it and the anger arrived before anything he could do with it. Young anger has that movement. It goes toward the available target, not the right one. And the available target in that moment was me. He stood up. I didn't move. And then the words came. Those words, without preparation, without retreat, with all the force that accumulated pain has when it finally finds a way out. I knew as he spoke that this wasn't about me. I knew it had its origin in grief, in Luciano's absence, in the emptiness that had become a question that had become a tension that was now coming out this twisted, wrong way. I knew all of this as I listened. But knowing where a knife comes from doesn't change the cut. You're not my mother. You're nobody. You should have left me at the door where you found me. And then he went to his room, picked up his backpack, came back down the hall, passed by me. The front door opened, closed. Of everything that came after, the silence that took over the room, the papers I had let go of without noticing and that had fallen around my feet, the sound of the car outside that faded until it disappeared. What remained with the most clarity was the fact that I didn't bend down to pick up the papers. I went to the nearest chair and sat. Not like someone who decides to sit, like someone who no longer has enough structure to remain standing. I sat there with my hands in my lap, looking at the papers scattered on the floor without being able to form a complete thought. The coffee was still on the coffee table, steam rising thinly as if the world had kept functioning while something inside the room had broken apart. Later, at some moment I can't time, I picked up the phone. I opened my contacts. Mateus's name was at the top, where it always was. My thumb hovered above the screen for a long time. It didn't tap. It stayed suspended there, as if the finger itself needed a reason that wasn't coming. And then I set the phone on the table. I didn't go after him. Not because I didn't want to, because I knew that going after him in that moment wouldn't be love. It would be my need. My need for that pain to stop, my need for immediate repair, my inability to sit with that silence. And he didn't need me when he was like that. He needed space to go, to find what he was looking for, to have the meeting I had prepared for him without his knowing. And then he was going to need a place to come back to. I had to be that place. And that place couldn't be standing outside the door with his name on my lips. And look, I know there are people listening to me now who have known that kind of silence, the one where you hold the phone, the name on the screen, and choose not to press. Drop a comment telling me where you're from. I want to know if there are others going through this like me. But it cost. I need to say that clearly because it would be dishonest not to, and this whole story has been about not hiding the cost of things. Sitting there, with the phone on the table, his name on the screen, and not pressing, that was one of the most costly choices I made in 58 years of life. Not because it was the wrong choice, but because the right choice and the easy choice are very different things, and confusing the two is a way of understanding nothing about what it means to truly love someone. The night was long. I didn't sleep much. I lay listening to the house with the attention the house only receives when it's very quiet and you're very awake inside it. The refrigerator, the kitchen clock, a dog barking somewhere in the distance for a while and then stopping, the wind, and silence, and more silence, and me in the middle of it all, choosing not to call, not to send a message, not to go. The next day, I kept to my routine as best I could. I woke up, made coffee, read something I retained almost nothing of, walked through the neighborhood going through the motions rather than truly walking. I came back, made lunch, cleaned the kitchen. I functioned in a way that wasn't pretending but wasn't normalcy either. It was that thing we do when we're waiting for something we can't hurry. You do the usual tasks, so the hours pass without the full weight of them sitting all at once in your chest. I didn't send a message, I didn't call. I let the silence exist the way it needed to exist, for as long as it needed to last. But I thought about Mateus arriving in that small town, about how he would sit inside the car for a while before being able to open the door, because I knew my son and knew that he was the kind of person who needed a moment before a moment. He always had. I thought about Simone in the park with her children, not knowing quite how it would be when he appeared, whether she would have the courage to say what I had asked when she was face to face with the son she hadn't raised. And I thought about everything I had kept for 22 years, the folded note in the folder, Simone's number, the path I had opened for him without his knowing, and I asked myself whether I had done enough, whether I had prepared the ground in the right way or in the way I needed to believe was right. There was no way to know before it happened. You do what you believe is right with what you have in hand, in that specific moment, with the information available in that specific moment. And then you let the world do the part that belongs to the world. That is the limit of love, and accepting that limit is perhaps the hardest thing there is. On the third day after his departure, the doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen when the sound arrived. I didn't hurry. I walked to the door at my usual pace because there was a quietness in that moment I didn't want to disturb with haste. There was also, I won't deny it, the fear that it might not be him, or that it was him in a way I wasn't prepared to receive. My heart went faster than my feet. I put my hand on the handle. I opened it. It was Mateus, without the large backpack, just the small one on his back. His face was the same it had always been, the dark eyes that had stayed the same since he was a baby inside a wicker basket, the jawline that time hadn't changed. But there was something different in his expression, a quality I couldn't name immediately, but that I recognized from somewhere. The kind of thing that appears on someone's face when they went looking for an answer and came back with something that isn't exactly what they expected to find. Not better or worse, but different, more true than what they had imagined. I opened the door wider. He came in. We didn't embrace immediately. It wasn't the kind of moment where the embrace is the first thing. He went to the living room, stood for an instant, looking around as if checking whether the place was still what it was. Then he sat on the sofa. The same sofa from which he had said those words 3 days before. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee again. Reflex, habit, the way this house always received difficult conversations. I came back with both cups. I sat across from him on the coffee table. I didn't ask anything. I let the space exist until it was filled by his voice. He began to tell it slowly, with those pauses I've known since he was small. The way he assembles something in his head while speaking, as if he needs to test the weight of each part before delivering it outward. He said he had arrived early in the town, that he had sat inside the car for a while before being able to open the door. His hands didn't want to cooperate with the decision. When he got to the park, he saw Simone from a distance before she saw him. She was with two small boys in a playground area, crouched beside one of them, laughing at something the boy had done. Her hair moved with the motion. The children ran around with that specific energy of small children in open spaces. He stood watching for a while. He said he tried to match what he was seeing with what he had imagined all his life, and that the two images didn't fit together in any way he yet knew how to describe. Not in a bad way. In a way that simply wasn't what he had expected to find when he left home that day. A life that existed completely without him, that was real and structured and full in a way he hadn't imagined with that kind of specificity. When Simone saw him and walked in his direction, there was something in her expression that he said he hadn't expected. Not explicit guilt, not calculated coldness to protect herself. It was the weight of someone who has been carrying an account they know exists for a long time and whose time to face has come. There was no request for forgiveness in words. There was something in the way she looked that revealed she knew exactly what she had given up 2 decades before in a note folded in 4 beside a wicker basket. They were together for almost 2 hours in the park. She answered what he asked, about the pregnancy that arrived before she had the structure to receive it, about the fear that paralyzed her, about the relationship that ended and then came back differently, about her parents, who had warned her and whom she couldn't hear at the time, about the running away, about the abandonment, about the silence that came after when she no longer knew where to start rebuilding, about everything. Mateus went quiet for a moment after telling this. He took a sip of coffee. He was looking at the cup, not at me, as if the story he was going through needed an object to rest on before coming back. And then he said that at the end, when he asked her why she had left, why that specific baby, on that specific doorstep, to me, Simone had answered with something he had carried back as if he needed to say it in the exact words so nothing would be lost along the way. She had said, "I only gave you life. Your mother is Lucia. Thanks to her, you're alive." Silence. The coffee was between us, steam still rising, thin. The afternoon was closing outside the window, that light that changes quality at the end of the day, growing warmer for a brief moment before going away. And Mateus raised his eyes to me with those dark eyes I have known since the day he fit entirely inside my arm. He set the cup down. He looked at his own hands for a moment, hands open on his knees, fingers slightly spread. I had known that gesture since he was small. It was the way his hands rested when he was about to say something that cost him. I had never forgotten that gesture, and then he said it. "Forgive me, Mom. I was wrong." The word Mom came from his voice differently this time. I can't explain precisely what was different, but the body perceives before the mind can name it. My hands, which had been wrapped around the coffee cup, relaxed without my telling them to. Like when you were holding something with a force you didn't know you were using, and you can finally let go. A pressure that existed underneath that only becomes visible when it leaves. I didn't say everything was fine, because everything wasn't fine yet, and a lie of comfort doesn't help anyone in the long run. I didn't say I knew he would come back, because saying that would be taking away the weight of the choice he had made, and the weight was part of it. He needed to carry that weight to understand what it had cost. I didn't say anything beautiful or perfectly right, no phrase that could be framed and hung on the wall. I simply extended my hand across the coffee table, slowly, and he placed his hand inside mine. We stayed like that for a while, with the coffee cooling between us, because in our house the coffee has always gone cold before we finish the important conversations. The afternoon fading outside. The silence of the room that was now different. Not empty, not absent. Full of something else. There are things I still don't know. I don't know if Mateus resolved everything he went looking for in that park. I don't know if the hole closed completely or only changed shape, size, location, if it will need more time, more conversations, more things I can't foresee yet. I don't know what happened inside him when he saw Simone with her children playing at the playground before approaching her, what occurred in that space between seeing from a distance and walking toward her. Perhaps he himself doesn't know yet. These things take time, and time is the one thing that has no shortcut. What I know is that when he called me Mom that day, with the slightly trembling voice he tried not to let show, I understood that I had never needed to prove anything, because a mother is not the one who gives birth. It's the one who stays. And I stayed. I stayed when he was a baby in a wicker basket with a pale blue blanket faded at the edges. I stayed when he grew and asked sideways questions about where the shape of his nose came from. I stayed when he lost his father, and the silence changed quality, and I didn't know how to reach the hole he was carrying. I stayed when he said I was nobody. I kept staying. And keeping that note for 22 years inside a document folder, having Simone's number and not using it without the right time, preparing the path so he could go without my knowing what he would find on the other side. That was love of the kind that doesn't need recognition to keep existing. The kind that stays even when the door slams. The kind that opens the door when the person comes back. And I opened it. If this story touched you, if it left a mark on you in some way, share it. Because there are mothers out there keeping folded notes in document folders. There are children out there carrying a question they haven't yet had the courage to ask out loud. And sometimes the most courageous thing in the world isn't the fight, isn't the confrontation, isn't the explanation given at the right time. It's opening the door when the person comes back, without demanding, without charging, without needing them to immediately understand the size of what it costs to stay. If you'd like to hear more moving stories like this one, click on one that's appearing on your screen right now. Click on one and keep being moved with us.